Hello and welcome to today's Inside Story. I'm very, very happy today to have with me Mark Aldridge, who is the author of, amongst other books, this fabulous biography of Hercule Poirot. Now, you all know my love of Agatha Christie. So for me, this is really, really exciting. Thank you so much, Mark, for agreeing to be rescheduled. Mark's original date was scuppered by the death of the Queen. And so he's come to us a bit later than he'd planned, but actually I'm thrilled that there's always an emphasis on Agatha Christie towards Christmas time. So I think this is fascinating. So welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us on Goldster.
Thanks, Lucinda. Yes, you're absolutely right about Christmas. I'm just dashing off after this to Radio 4 are doing a Christie at Christmas thing for Open Book on Boxing Day. So I'm recording something for that after this today. So yeah, Christie for Christmas is definitely in vogue at the moment.
And tell us about the original Christie for Christmas, because I just love that phrase.
Well, so Christie for Christmas was this sort of, it's funny because I was talking about it the other day to somebody. It came about sort of quite organically that for a long time she wrote several books a year, especially in the 1930s. And then when she got to sort of the 1950s, she was in her 60s at this point. That was when, for various reasons, it was actually more economical for her to mostly write one book a year. And it just was quite organic that they started to be sold around October, November time, because they're really good presents for Christmas. And then the reviewers, actually, as much as anything, started to call them the Christie for Christmas. So it became this sort of annual tradition that had, you know, you'd think that a publisher would have worked it out before anyone else, but actually it was sort of the reviewers that started to say, oh, there's Christie for Christmas. But I was just writing something yesterday for the Miss Marple book that I'm working on at the moment, where one of her publishers, write to her agent and say if she could finish, they do it with mirrors in time to publish it for November. That will add at least 15,000 copies to the sales of the book. So it was a big old thing.
Did she manage to do it on time?
She did manage to do it on time. Always that little sort of the thing of, you know, you could make a little bit more money from this was always a good way to get, like any good writer.
Like any author, pretty much, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I'm going to put a link here in the chat to this book. So tell us, I love this idea, the idea of doing a biography of a fictional character. Where did you come up with this idea? And was it something that had been in your mind for a long time?
Yeah, so it's sold as a biography because I think the American publisher particularly really liked that. It's not like a fictional biography, it's a factual biography. So it's about Poirot, the character, and the sort of phenomenon. It's not saying Poirot was born, you know, in 18 whatever, because we don't know that sort of information. It's about tracing his development from 1920 up to the present day and how he's been used in different ways and everything.
The evolution of Hercule Poirot.
That's exactly it. That's it. And in fact, I'd called it the story of Poirot for a long time, and it was decreed too boring by my publishers and other people, actually. But in my head, that's always what the book is. It's the story of Poirot. But I'd written another book.
Yes.
Christie on Screen, which was from an academic press, but isn't a terribly academic book, has to be said. But it's got loads of research in it that was new about Agatha Christie on screen, the screen adaptations, and it did really well. Not just, you know, sales wise, it did fine, but in terms of the ways that people latched onto it and the sort of feedback I get from people and the interest from like the radio and the press and lots of things, people asking me about it, made me think, well, I still love Agatha Christie, and I'd gone through the main archives and I knew there was loads of stuff that was unpublished and lots of stuff that hadn't really been spoken about. And I thought, well, where is the book that you could say, sit down one day and say, I'm going to read, let's say 450 from Paddington. And I want to find out the background information to it. I just want to know a little bit about why she wrote it, what her influences were, how it was received, anything interesting about it. And that book doesn't really exist. Charles Osborne wrote a brilliant book, The Life and Crimes of Agatha Christie, but it is sort of over 30 years old and know quite a lot more than we did then. And then I thought, well, that's just stupid. That's far too big a book to publish because it would be probably 300,000+ words. So I thought, well, we're coming up to the Poirot centenary. This was in about 2018 and 2017, and Poirot turned 100 in 2020 or 2021, depending on how you want to count it. And I thought, well, maybe I could just do the Poirot ones. And if that does well, maybe I could convince them. So I emailed David Braun at HarperCollins, who I'd met at a few Agatha Christie events, and he's in charge of the Agatha Christie estate.
He came on to Goldster, actually. He did a wonderful, wonderful interview with Humphrey.
Oh, wonderful. Well, he's really so informative and interesting and enthusiastic. And I knew that he'd liked Agatha Christie on screen. And so I said, well, how about this? Like an accessible, something you can buy, you know, your mum for Christmas sort of book, because she's interested in Agatha Christie. And it was a bit, you know, he was enthusiastic. It's a lot of people who've got to say yes before you get the, you know, the thing I'm most proud of, well, maybe not most proud of, but very proud of, is that I get the signature, the official Agatha Christie signature.
That's so important. We'll talk about that in a while.
Yeah, oh, it's trademarked. And so you've got to be, you know, and so it's a very rare to get that on a non-fiction book. And that's because it's had, you know, it's authorized. So yes, that was it. So went through that long process, and this is how I ended up with this book. Just that, you know, the writing was the easy bit, the dealing with everyone else is the tough stuff.
Because I was going to ask you how you managed to get it to be so official, and I love the fact that you did, because I know the Agatha Christie estate, you know, is understandably, you know, really closed off, and they're very careful about what they give their, you know, their approval to. So they must have really loved your idea to be able to give that to you.
Yeah, well, so when I wrote Agatha Christie on screen, Matthew Pritchard, who's the grandson of Agatha Christie, was chairman of Agatha Christie Limited, chairman of the board, and then retired, and his son is now chairman of the board. So I'd had a good relationship, or still do have a good relationship with Matthew, who sort of houses the family archive and stuff as well. And so I sort of ran it by him, and then it has to be signed off by lots and lots of people. And, you know, quite rightly, you have lots of questions asked of you, and you have to, you know, negotiate a little bit about what the sort of span of it would be. There was no sort of question of censorship or anything, I should say. Nobody was coming in saying, you can't talk about this, can't talk about that. You know, but it went off and it was read by their lawyers, which is probably a good thing to check that I'm not libeling anybody. But yes, you just sort of have to show it to them, and then it comes back. And then if there's anything that you want to sort of negotiate about, but really it was quite straightforward in the end. I was very lucky.
Yeah, brilliant. So how did you begin your research? Did you just read all the Poirot books and think, fantastic? Or because you wrote about his, you know, about the creation of Poirot rather than just about Poirot himself, did you get the chance to go into Agatha Christie's archives at Agatha Christie Limited?
Yeah, so I went through everything basically. So I'd gone through a lot of stuff for Agatha Christie on screen, but obviously not necessarily about Poirot, about other stuff. So I knew the type of material that existed. And that was a big reason as to why I wanted to do this book, because I thought, well, I know there's all this material. So yes, I obviously read the books again as I went through. I had reread them all for on screen, so it hadn't been too long since I'd read them, but I went over them again anyway. And what I did, whenever I read each book, I would make notes about anything I thought was particularly interesting that I might want to discuss, whether it was a character or a plot device that she used, or a location or whatever. And then it was, sort of the long haul of consulting lots of different archives. So the main ones that I consulted, the Agatha Christie Archive Trust, which is the family archive, which holds, as you would imagine, most of the personal stuff, some of the typescripts, those ones that survive are there, and various other things. So I negotiated, that was part of the negotiation with Agatha Christie Limited, who don't really have an archive of their own. Mm-hmm. It's the family that you know you need to go to. So that was part of the negotiation, was that I would have access to that. And at the University of Exeter, it has been used a lot over the years. There are her agents' archives, so that's really huge. So it's all of the correspondence. Well, what survives of the correspondence is all kept there. So that includes, because this is the 1930s up to the 1970s, there are lots of carbon copies. So you get both sides of the conversation, which is really, really useful. So you might have our agent writing to her and saying, oh, can you get this book ready for July so that we can get it out for November for A Christie for Christmas? And then you get the reply as well. But it was absolute masses. I would say I've spent maybe 7 or 8 weeks there over the years. And every time I go back, I find something new because it's just so much that it's really easy to miss. So there's those two, HarperCollins, previously Collins, that archive's got some really nice stuff in it as well. And that's one of the few times that we can be thankful to COVID, because prior to COVID, the only way to consult that archive was to go up and in Scotland, not in the middle of a major city, but somewhere random in Scotland is where the archive is. And I remember looking at it and going, oh my God, that's going to be a hell of a journey. But thankfully, because people couldn't travel, they scanned a lot of the material that I could go through and go, I'd quite like that and quite like that. So that saved me a huge journey.
Yeah, it's made a huge difference. The number of collections that are now digitized after the pandemic is just such a joy for researchers. It might have been a nightmare at the time. I had a book deadline I just had to stop because I couldn't get into archives.
Yeah.
But by the end of it, suddenly they were saying, oh, well, actually, you can look at our collections online. So that's one thing to be thankful for the last few weird years that we've been through.
It was weird navigating that whole, because it was that thing about when lockdown sort of started to lift a little bit. And so you're like, now like I remember going to the British Library and photographing like the magazine serializations. It's got some lovely illustrations and often a slightly different versions of the stories. And just trying to get as many done as a day as possible, thinking I'm not sure that this is going to be open again next week, because nobody knew day to day what was happening. And I filmed this documentary, I think it's on Netflix now, it was on Channel 5 at the time, and it was just when hairdressers has started to open again, but you couldn't get an appointment, like it was really difficult. And so every time I see that coming up on Netflix, like sometimes the thumbnail is of my face with this like huge hair because you just couldn't get rid of it. And that was a really weird day, going to central London, nobody being there, because it was one of the first days that you could travel for non-essential business, but for work, it had to be for work, but
yes. And it seems such a long time ago now, but really it wasn't that long ago, but I think we've all tried to put it behind us. But it is extraordinary how much our careers have changed. The very fact that we're sitting here doing this interview, on Zoom, and knowing that, people are watching it from all over the place is, I find, just really fascinating. So tell us about your career so far, because you're an academic. Did you always intend to write books as well? What do you teach, and what is your...
So I'm an associate professor of screen histories at Solent University in Southampton. So basically film and TV histories is a thing that I'm really interested in. I did my undergrad degree, well, I did all of my studies at the University of Southampton, also in Southampton, but it's the older university. And I did my undergrad in English and film, and then a master's in film, because I just sort of thought I wasn't quite done, and there was more I wanted to do. And then I started to think, oh, I really am enjoying the research side of this, and I'd be quite happy to do teaching. I enjoy teaching as well. And so I thought, well, PhD might be the way to go for this. So I did a PhD, which had nothing to do with Agatha Christie whatsoever. It was about the invention of television in the UK, so the early days of British television. And that was sort of my specialism for a little while. So I got, at the end of my PhD studies, I was doing part-time teaching at both Southampton University, so Solent and University of, and then a full-time job came up at Solent just as I was finishing my studies, my PhD, which I got. And I just stayed there ever since, because it's strange, because it's not a research university, or historically hasn't been a research university, and yet you have to have research to be a university. It actually means that you're sort of quite a big fish in a small pond. So it's quite, although there isn't the huge infrastructure for research that you might get at, Southampton or, your Oxfords and Cambridges and everything. What you do get is that people support you, because its value seems by itself higher than being one of 100 researchers in your area that you might get elsewhere. So I've stayed there quite happily for the last few years. And then, like I say, I just wrote that Agatha Christie on screen because I was just so annoyed that nobody had done it, and I really wanted this book. So I thought, well, why don't I do that? I'd put it off because I didn't want to ruin my enjoyment of Agatha Christie by making it into work. But I thought, well, no one else seems to be doing it. This seems like you know, the worst case scenario is I'll turn it into a couple of chapters for another book. And if it goes well, I'll put it all together. So I did. And then it just hasn't stopped since. My boss always jokes about the Agatha train. He says, how's the Agatha train going at the moment? Because it just trundles on and on and on. There is really no stopping it. It's a bit of a runaway, really.
It must be the only train in Britain that's still going on and on. At the moment.
It's yeah, very good.
So is your thesis what you turned into the birth of British television, a history? I'm going to put this link in the chat. Tell us about this, because I haven't read this one, but it looks really fascinating. So tell us about the birth of British television.
So this was really about, it is, yes, this is pretty much my PhD thesis, with it sort of moved around and some of it taken out because it's a bit too boring. But basically, my PhD thesis was early British television attitudes and expectations. So that was what my focus was about when television as we know it started November 1936. That's the first regular high definition, in those days, high definition television service, which was the BBC. There were lots before that actually, but sort of lower definition, irregular, loads from like the late 1920s, both here and in America in particular, a bit in France and Germany. But what I was really interested in was tracing that story in terms of what people thought television could be and how that changed. So I looked at sort of the internal documentation that was held at the BBC, all the way through to things like newspaper reports, and really was interested in tracing this idea of going, what is television? And it is funny to look at now. I mean, even what you refer to television as, whether you're a seer or, you know, as a television viewer, and what the audience would be, how interactive it was expected to be, little things that in academia we call televisuality, which is like the essence of live television, which are things that we don't really think about now, which is that when you watch the One Show or the news, the presenter will look straight down the camera. Whereas, of course, when you watch a drama or whatever, the camera's ignored. It's like it's not there. And that whole thing, that we actually are quite sophisticated as viewers, that we can understand that distinction between when a presenter is directly addressing us. But it took a long time to work those sorts of things out. And it's in one of the Agatha Christie books that whenever I do refer to an early Agatha Christie TV production, I always say what else was on the same night, because it's always quite funny. First time the Mousetrap was shown, a version of the story Three Blind Mice, it was followed by Puppet Parade, which you can sort of guess what sort of entertainment that might have been. And that's the sort of thing. It's like it was whatever could go on TV, made it on TV.
And why do you think that Agatha Christie endures? I mean, you know, you're talking about it having been on screen so early on, and yet it's still, of all the kind of, you know, the major crime writers, particularly of the Golden Age, she is the one who is constantly used. So what is it you think that makes her translate to the screen so well?
She has extremely good and tight stories. Like that's one thing. And I think what really works well for screen is that there's small cast of characters, that they're not very long novels, and that they have a very definite end. And that might sound like a really odd thing to say, but how often do you read a novel that is you have to interpret, or where your understanding of how it's worked towards its conclusion is personal? Agatha Christie, it's not really. I mean, you might occasionally get it with a character but she's very, very clear with the audience. These are the characters we meet. There is a mystery. By the end of the novel or an hour of TV, it will be resolved, and you are confident it will be resolved. Like it's an agreement with the reader or the audience that by the end you will know who done it and why and how, and that satisfaction works so well for film and TV. And I think she works much better than, well, any other mystery writer, really. I was watching some of the old Dorothy L. Sayers ones, Lord Peter Wimsey, which is sort of from the 70s. So they're slightly different era anyway. But they don't translate that well. I mean, it's a good series in lots of ways, and we enjoyed watching it. But it's very chatty. It's a lot of character. It's a lot of sort of about the people. And that is quite difficult to do on TV. Whereas Agatha Christie, it's plot, plot, plot. Characters are really important too. Her characterization is massively underrated. but the plot is what keeps it all going.
And how involved was she at the very beginning when what was her first work to be adapted for television?
Oh yeah, really early. So 1937. So still live TV. The Wasp's Nest, which is a short story,
Yeah.
Poirot short story, that she had made into a one-act play that Francis L. Sullivan, who'd played Poirot on stage a few times, he was going to perform it at some charity function, but it never happened for whatever reason. And then when the BBC was sniffing around for short, good plays that they could stage in one studio with a small cast, Wasp's Nest was brilliant because it has 4 characters. It's very dialogue heavy. It's only got one location, which is a garden, which basically it doesn't survive because it's pre-recording of TV, but we've got a couple of photos and it's a patio set on some astroturf. You know, that's all you need, that and a cardboard brick wall behind them. That's all you need, and you've got a garden. So that was the first one, and she wasn't really involved at all. She never liked television, so she approved it, but that was it really. Got to remember 1937, a few thousand people within Greater London they're the only people who are going to be able to see it.
Right, gosh.
So it's really, really small. And then later on, she became quite anti-television, I think because, well, various reasons, but one big thing was that in 1949, the BBC did, and then there were none. And again, we don't have a recording because it's too early, but she was told by someone who'd watched it that when the general dies in it, unfortunately the camera caught him then standing up and walking off set. So she'd heard this and was very upset about it, and that for her was sort of you know, this is not something that should take my stories.
Oh my goodness, that is dreadful. So do you feel that you've got to know Agatha Christie through going through the letters that she and her publishers and agent perhaps wrote to each other, and through getting to know her characters?
Yeah, I do think so. It's really interesting that you can read stuff, and I'll read things and go, oh, she's not going to like that, and then a couple of pages later you see the reply and went, no, she didn't like that. I was reading something the other day where they were saying that they wanted to publish Three Blind Mice, which is the short story originally something else that became The Mousetrap. And they said, oh, we'd like to have a short story collection based around it in the UK because there'd been one in America already. And I was just like, she's never going to let you do that in a million years. She's told you already she doesn't want that. And then 2 days later, you go, no, underlined, absolutely not. Yes. So yeah, I think so. And I think what I really got a sense of was that she was somebody who had very strong opinions, quite rightly, wasn't a difficult person, but felt very strongly about when things weren't right. And she was very happy to defer a lot of decisions to her agent and later on her family. So things like, what's the best contract to sign? Should we give permission for this? That was basically all dealt with by her agent, and she'd just get a summary. She wanted more control over the actual book elements. That was what she really paid attention to. And so things like covers of books, she got very upset when she wasn't shown them. You think, which just seems like quite reasonable that you would show Agatha Christie, but they didn't always.
Author should do their covers. That's extraordinary.
I know, yeah, but they would just say things like, "Oh, well, it's the war. We don't have time to send things. Things get lost on the post." I don't think it's any great.
Nothing changes, does it?
No, exactly. And blurbs that gave too much away. She had a real thing about that as well. So she'd often, those blurbs that you find on the early editions are very often written by her because she would rewrite them and send them back. But she was quite right to check this stuff. I've just been writing about A Murder Is Announced, which I won't spoil for anyone who hasn't read it. But let's just say that the spelling of certain words is extremely important in A Murder Is Announced. And so she would get back typescripts from it, and they had helpfully corrected the spelling of these words, and they don't go back and back. But funnily enough, I was looking through the Collins stuff the other day, and this continued to be a problem up to the 1980s. In the early 80s, somebody wrote to Collins and said, I've just reread A Murder Is Announced with your nice new edition, and I noticed that this word is spelled like this, and it should be like this. And they apologized and they retypeset it. sort of someone got a slap on the wrist. And then for the following print run, they went back to the incorrectly corrected one. So you had to go back all the time to check these things. And you can understand the frustration
Oh,
of someone like
definitely.
Agatha Christie, who I remember the first edition of Five Little Pigs. If you open it, the first line has a typo in it. For an Agatha Christie novel in the
Oh my goodness, no,
1940s, when
that
she's
makes
like
me feel better. One
yeah,
of my
yeah,
books has a typo on the first line, and or the first sentence, not the first line. And I was so gutted. So I feel better.
yes, you should.
I remember going back to my manuscript and going, it was actually correct in the manuscript. It's actually been introduced in the so-called editorial process. So I can't believe it happened to Agatha as well. But I hope you like her since you've been getting to know
Oh,
her
yeah.
well. Oh,
Yeah,
good.
I do. I feel really, really sympathetic towards her quite a lot, actually. There are lots of things in it that I read through that make me feel quite sorry for her, because there's especially stuff around in the 1960s. So she's in her 70s at this point, and there's like a big film deal with MGM that leads to the Margaret Rutherford Miss Marple films, and she didn't want to do it, but she also said, well, I held out till I'm 70, and she knew that there was a company, Agatha Christie Limited, you've got to make money. And so she did it, and they upset her enormously. She is really, really upset by not so much the first one or two, but when you get to sort of Murder Ahoy, which is a made-up story with Miss Marple dressed up like an admiral, you can understand her being very upset about it. This woman 75 or 74-ish being given this sort of script. So that was it then. She sort of stopped looking at any scripts after that point. So yeah, I definitely felt I felt very positive towards her. And it's amazing, like occasionally you'll read I read a letter a few months ago that just sort of turned up, or I hadn't seen it before. And it was a sort of a letter written around the time that she married Max Mallowan, who's her second husband, and just the happiness that came out of it made me just feel really cheered that this poor woman who'd had a very difficult separation from her husband and death of her mother, a couple of years later was able to find real genuine happiness. So that was a sort of lovely thing to see.
And so tell us also about Poirot. What about him most intrigues you? Do you like him or dislike him?
Oh, I think I'd find him insufferable if I met him. But he's a fascinating, brilliant character. And what I think is really great about him is that he's a really pure detective. So he's very evidence-based, and sometimes that can be psychological evidence. And sometimes it can be the ash in the fire grate, or the old-fashioned Sherlock Holmes sort of stuff. And I really like that, because I think that to have an effective murder mystery, you've got to have somebody who's really playing fair. And there are different ways to do that. And Miss Marple is very different. And I think that she is very psychological. She's very about, this is human nature. Whereas Poirot is very much about, this is the evidence, and there is now only one sort of conclusion we can come to from this. So I think that is brilliant. What I find really interesting, once everyone is now so familiar with like the David Suchet series, is that when you go back and read the novels, sometimes they really chime with him, but he's a massively changeable character, and especially his relationship with Hastings. They do not get on quite often. They have a lot of arguments, and they don't always go resolved by the end of them. But you just sort of have to imagine that they make up off the page in between stories.
Well, yes, Captain Hastings puts up with a huge amount, I think, from Poirot.
Yes.
And what do you think of the element of, are they meant to be Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson? Do you think she was consciously playing to that with Poirot and Captain Hastings?
I think that the earlier ones, definitely. I think so, especially the early short stories. So Mysterious Affair at Styles was the first Poirot story, full stop. It's a novel. And the way that especially Hastings is introduced is so Watson. The war injury, and just the way that he, the fact that he narrates it, which obviously Watson does, that is really, really significant. And both Poirot and Sherlock Holmes as these detectives who don't quite fit into society for some reason. Sherlock Holmes is very, what do we call it, solipsistic. His world is the whole world. and everyone else sort of doesn't matter that much. And Poirot is a little bit like that, but of course he's also a Belgian refugee, so he literally doesn't fit in to British society at the time. And it means that they both get to play this outsider game. They both get to be underestimated, and yet they will naturally reach a conclusion. So yeah, the early ones definitely are very, very Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And there are I think The Man with the Twisted Lip is very similar to, say, The Disappearance of Mr. Davenheim, for example. There are quite a few of the Poirot short stories that are almost remakes of Sherlock Holmes ones.
I hadn't made that connection before, but that's, now you've said it, that seems so obvious. What do you think? Do you know what Agatha Christie thought about Arthur Conan Doyle?
Yeah, and do you know what? I don't think they ever met, which is a shame, is it? But she was a huge admirer of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes and Gaston Leroux's The Mystery of the Yellow Room, they were the big influences on her. There were other ones as well. Anna Catherine Green wrote a novel I read not very long ago, actually, because I'd never read it before. I wasn't terribly impressed by, but I think you can sort of, it went a bit A Study in Scarlet. You know how in A Study in Scarlet it starts wonderfully atmospherically, and then you have like 100 pages in America, and everyone goes, do we need this? Like, you can sort of skip that 100 pages and it's just sort of character motivation that you don't really need. It's a little bit like that, which Agatha Christie doesn't really do. She always makes you feel that everything is relevant, even when you might get to the end and be like, that was a massive red herring. You've still enjoyed following that red herring along.
Well, like Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie got totally fed up with her creation, didn't she? So tell us a bit about her relationship with Hercule Poirot.
Yeah, so she did get fed up with him, but it wasn't quite. She's been not misquoted, but unfairly quoted in this a little bit, because yes, she got fed up with him. So in the 1930s, she relied on the money of writing these novels quite fairly and rightly. So she was actually writing 3 a year quite often. And so at that sort of pace, I would defy anybody to get a little bit fed up with what they're having to write, because Poirot was so commercially successful that as many Poirots as you could do made sense. And she wrote this introduction for Appointment with Death in 1938, I think, in which she famously says how she's fed up with this annoying little man, basically. But after that, at the end of the article, she actually says, but actually he's won, because actually I have come round to him in my affections a little bit. And she did start to write for him a little bit less. There are more Miss Marple mysteries by the 1950s in particular. And Poirot sort of can disappear into the background. And I think a few interesting things happened in the 40s and 50s, which was firstly that the magazines in America, which paid huge amounts to serialize Agatha Christie stories and were very important, started to say that actually they were less interested in what they called the stock detectives. So detectives who are already well known solving yet another case. So half of the financial incentive was starting to disappear. And then by the 1950s, she was mostly writing 1 book a year anyway. So even if you alternated between a Miss Marple, a Poirot, and another random detective, or a no detective at all story, that's still only 1 book every 3 years. And she started to write to her agent at this point and saying, do you want a Poirot next, or doesn't it matter? She was much more relaxed by the time it got to that point. But the 30s, yeah, when she really had to write quite a lot to keep her income going, that was a low point for their relationship, I think.
And do you know how Poirot is received in Belgium? Because obviously he is a Belgian refugee. Is there a knowledge of him in Belgium? Do people read Agatha Christie, or are they just not that interested?
That's a really good question. Yeah, he is known about, but he's not revered or anything in the way that you might expect him to be. I was in Belgium a few years ago, actually, and I looked it up at the time, wondering if there was like a Poirot museum. I don't think there is, but somebody could prove me wrong. But I certainly couldn't find one at the time. But no, I don't think he's hailed as a hero or anything. He's certainly read, Agatha Christie's certainly read in Belgium, as she is in continental Europe more generally. But no, he's not taken on sort of hero status, I think, which is a bit of a shame. But then she did this whole thing about having Ariadne Oliver, her mystery writer character, create Sven Hjersen, a Finnish detective, and Ariadne just constantly complains about the fact that she doesn't know anything about Finns, and why does she ever make him a Finn, which is clearly a joke about her thinking, why did I make him Belgian? I don't know anything about Belgium. I mean, who does really? I don't mean that to be rude to Belgium, but it's not like it's a country that is taught extensively at school, let's put it that way.
We've got a comment from someone who says they're half Finnish.
Oh, there you go. So you can go and correct Ariadne next.
So do you think that Ariadne Oliver was meant to be a kind of spoof on Agatha Christie? Was she really putting herself into it, or was she just kind of paying a nod to those who expected her to put herself into her books?
No, she definitely is, and especially as the books go on, Ariadne Oliver becomes more and more Agatha Christie, which is why you get more and more of Ariadne in those later books, and quite a lot. I mean, Elephants Can Remember, which is famously not one of her greats, and is the last Poirot novel to be written, and her penultimate novel to be written. That has pages and pages of Ariadne Oliver just talk about anything from sort of her teeth to meringues to the right thing to wear as a hat. And there's this really good encounter, which I think is pure Agatha Christie, of where early in the book, Ariadne meets somebody at a function. Agatha Christie hated meeting people. She was very, very private. She hated speaking in front of people and all that sort of stuff. And somebody goes and introduces themselves to Ariadne Oliver and says, "Oh, I do love your stuff, and I really do feel like we're friends." And Ariadne says, "Oh, I really I wish we weren't friends." She's like, "No, I wish you weren't thinking of us as friends." And that is pure Agatha Christie. That she's wants to be kept apart a little bit. She wasn't. I think about her in this day and age when you've got to do the publicity trail. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you're a best-selling author or what, you have to do the publicity trail. And just thinking she could never do it. She would just have given up rather than have done that, frankly. So we were lucky, really, that we got Agatha Christie just at the time that she could do it, because if she thought that was part of the job, you wouldn't have got her beyond sort of 1922.
But I think it's in the same book when Ariadne Oliver gets a phone call from Poirot, and she says, "Oh, good, I don't have to go and talk to this boring literary society now. I can get my..." And I thought that made me laugh so much that I first read it, because I thought, is that Agatha Christie herself telling people she does not want to go and talk to? And she even says things like, "Oh, they always ask me the same questions. I'm sorry, I don't know why. I've turned my phone off, but it still keeps."
Oh, I can't hear it.
Sorry, apologies to those who are recording this. There's a bit where I just thought, so this is Agatha Christie herself letting her readers know that she does not want to be invited to do literary events, and to leave her alone. And it's just really funny.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it. And she's just so sort of blunt at that point. And I think when people get older, they do get a bit more blunt anyway, because who have you got left to upset? You may as well be honest whilst you're, and she's definitely honest. That's a really good observation. There's lots of those things of her just not wanting to do things and being sort of bullied a little bit into trying to do it, but she's still saying no.
So you're working your next book is on Miss Marple. So you're giving her the same treatment as Poirot, is that right?
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm working on it right now. Yes, it's in what may be a first in the whole world of publishing. I actually have brought my deadline with my publisher forward a year because it was supposed to be in sort of 2 years, and I just found myself starting to write it quite naturally, and then thought, oh well, I may as well do it now, because I was going to take a year off and I didn't. So yes, supposed to be with my publisher in September next year, but I'm hoping to actually finish my draft in sort of May, and then spend the summer sending it off to a few people to get their thoughts, doing some tidying up, any last minute archival stuff I want to double check. But yeah, I'm really enjoying it. But yes, it's basically what I've done with Poirot, but with Miss Marple this time.
Tell us when Miss Marple appears in Agatha Christie's life, and the difference between her relationship with Miss Marple and her relationship with Poirot.
So she pops up first, actually. A lot of people think it's Murder at the Vicarage, but she's actually in short stories before then. So she was December 1927. She appears in the first of half a dozen Tuesday nightclub stories, where a group of friends get together and talk about interesting mysteries. And she's very much a Victorian at this point. She is wearing black lace, hat and a sort of shawl and everything. So quite different to sort of Joan Hickson Miss Marple that we think of later, that sort of tweed 1940s, 50s look. And then, yes, she very slowly integrates into Agatha Christie's writing career. So she then is in a novel, Murder at the Vicarage in 1930, a few more short stories that year put together as the 13 Problems. And then sort of there's a couple at the beginning of the 1940s, Moving Finger, Body in the Library, and that's sort of it for the first 25 years odd, or 22 odd years of Miss Marple's life. And then suddenly in the 1950s, she starts to be almost the main detective that Agatha Christie turns to, almost as much as Poirot. So she's in a lot more in the 50s and 60s, I suspect, because Agatha Christie was older herself at this point. And so when she first wrote Miss Marple in 1927, she was 37 years old, Agatha Christie. And by the time she was writing about a lot more Miss Marple novels in the 50s and 60s, she was in her 60s and 70s. So I guess it makes sense that maybe she was a bit more sympathetic towards Miss Marple's thinking by that point in her career.
And what was the public reaction? I mean, did they want another Poirot instead of a Miss Marple? Do you think that's why she wrote fewer, or was it just that they just loved whatever Christie wrote?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been going through reviews the other day, and it's I would say there are more reviews that say what a pleasure it is to see Miss Marple than those who say, oh, what a shame we're not getting Poirot this time. Because there'd been quite a lot of Poirots, especially by the time you get to the 1940s. He'd been in an awful lot of books by that point. Sort of 20 or so. So it makes sense that somebody new might come along. But they actually tend to be in really quite different mysteries as well. You know, as I say, Miss Marple's very human nature and sort of small community, really.
And do you think she was ever tempted? Have you found anything that might support this? Would she ever have been tempted to put them in a book together?
She explicitly did not want to. Yeah, she was asked and she said, no, I don't know why people think that. What would they have to talk about? But interestingly, the in her notebooks, Death on the Nile, so she sketched out lots of her ideas, most of her ideas in her notebooks, most of which still survive. And Death on the Nile has got a list of characters, and listed is Miss Marple. But it's not clear whether Miss Marple would have been there instead of Poirot, or whether she would have been one of the people there with Poirot. So there's the possibility. Certainly at some point she thought Miss Marple could have been in Death on the Nile, but whether she'd have been solving the case with Poirot or whether she would have been there instead of him, we don't know.
So you went to the Agatha Christie Festival this summer, I believe. What was it like after 2 years of festivals not really happening? Were people back there? Did they really enjoy it? Do you think there's still a reluctance to go to festivals?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was so good. I've been for a few years now. Obviously, we had an online one or two. We did have a very limited one last year, actually, I think. I get my years mixed up. But this year, it was definitely much more back to normal. Yeah, it was so lovely. And the great thing about speaking about Agatha Christie is that people love Agatha Christie. Like, they want to hear it and they are interested. That is such a treat. And as a university lecturer, I know how often I'm having to speak about things that have to be spoken about, but perhaps are not the most exciting for the people I'm speaking to. So with Agatha Christie, you know that people are always going to be really interested to hear something about her. So a lovely, kind, enthusiastic group of people go to that. Yeah, it's always a treat. I highly recommend it. It's in Torquay every September. People who are interested, so keep an eye out. I'd really recommend it.
And do you find that this is across the ages? I mean, you teach students as well. Is Agatha Christie still kind of enjoyable to people who are in their 20s, or is it all people who are kind of older and have grown up with Agatha Christie on TV all the time?
Oh, huge mixture of ages, really big mixture. I mean, I mostly teach film and television students, so they're not necessarily big fiction readers, and so Agatha Christie isn't on the radar of most of them, though they have a sort of understanding of who she is. But I know from speaking to colleagues who teach more in English and stuff that there's still massive interest in her. And I'm not privy to the precise sales figures, but I'm told they are at least as good as ever. There is no sign of interest in Agatha Christie dwindling away. And I think there are lots of things where you can see things that are successful for decades losing their grip. I was talking to somebody the other day about Elvis, but I feel like Elvis is not somebody who people in their 20s, 30s, 40s even are ever going to have that interest in. Whereas Agatha Christie finds a new audience because she captures you young and then she never quite lets go.
Yes, I mean, I remember first reading her as a young teenager. In fact, I think I was about 11 actually, and just loved her ever since. And I think it's one of those things you can read when you're younger, think as an adult book, but you can still get into it as a kind of younger reader. So perhaps that's why it still draws people in. So tell us about the fact that you've got an academic career alongside your writing. How do you fit your writing in? Do you have a particular routine? Do you have certain times of year when you can write more, or is it a bit peripatetic?
Well, yeah, it's quite variable, but I always aim to take Fridays off on research days, and that gives me Fridays through to the weekend to get stuff done that I want to do. But the bulk of writing I usually do in the breaks. As it happens with Marple, I've been writing a lot during teaching, and I don't quite know why that is. I happen to have a teaching year where I did a lot of preparation for these modules last year, and so they're all updated and ready to go. So I've been able to spend a bit more time on it than normal, but it's just being realistic. And I do what I tell my students to do, which is that I write down weekly goals, and I just make sure that I hit them. And sometimes it's really easy to hit them, and sometimes it requires a few late nights, but it's what the job is. If you want to get that book done, you've got to sit down and write it. No one's going to do it for you. Well, not in my level anyway. Maybe some other writers might just put their name on it and someone else gets to do it for them.
So that's really, really good advice, because we've got a lot of people here who I know are working with our Goldster creative writing tutor, and people are writing, some people are writing for the first time, some people are continuing their writing. So I love the idea of having a weekly goals thing. What kind of things do you put on that? Is it a number of words, or is it a number of hours, or
it's not hours, it's words. Or it might be like, I'll tell you what my goal is this week it's to finish writing up the newspaper reviews from 1950 to 1954. That's how exciting it is. But I want to go through them, pick out all of the bits of reviews that I might want to use in the book and have them typed up. And that is what I'll do. And once it's done, that will be it for the week. I won't do any more. I hit my goal and I stop, because you have to feel like you're always succeeding. And you can't feel like you're always failing because you don't finish a book every week. Well, you can't finish a book every week. You've got to finish what you need to do each week to get that book done in the longer term. So yeah, that's what I do. So I know that, what day is it today? Thursday. So I've got maybe a couple of hours left to do tomorrow morning. And if I don't get it done then I'll do an hour or two on Saturday. And we'll see what happens, but it will be done by the end of Sunday, unless I'm struck down by some terrible illness.
I hope that doesn't happen. You've been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. It's really been such a pleasure talking to you, Mark, and I can thoroughly recommend this book. It's really interesting for anybody who's got an interest in Agatha Christie, but also if you've got an interest in plotting and just looking at how you can create a character, how Agatha Christie manages to do so. So if you wouldn't mind just waiting with us just a moment, Mark, I'm going to tell everybody what is coming up on Goldster. So Humphrey is back with you tomorrow, and he's talking to Alex Shaw, international best-selling author of the Aidan Snow and Jack Tate stories. They're thrillers, and he himself has had a very adventurous kind of traveling life. He spent the second half of the 1990s in the Ukraine teaching drama and running his own business consultancy, and then he was headhunted and he went to that job that set him to work across the former Soviet Union, Middle East and Africa. And he writes thrillers based on what he has come to know through his own career. So really fascinating. And do join me on Tuesday next week with PPG. I'm going to be interviewing this man, Leroy Logan, and this is his book, his autobiography, My Life as a Cop. You may have seen the Small Axe series on the BBC a couple of years ago, and Leroy's life was actually featured in that. He was one of the very first kind of Black police officers in the Met. He helped found the Black Police Officers Association. He's an incredible campaigner for racial equality, and he's just done so many fascinating things. So that's on Tuesday on PPG. Please do join me for that. It's just going to be he's a brilliant speaker as well. It's going to be a great one. And then what have we got coming up just before Christmas? Next Thursday, Humphrey is back with you talking to Professor Samur Gray, who I think is very well known now through his work on Goldster as well, because he's just done a lot of work, but he's just got such a great attitude to health and aging, and he's reframing the public conversation about getting old. As you possibly know, he's written 2 books. They're called Sod 60 and Sod 70, and both are subtitled The Guide to Living Well. And he is just decided that he's not going to get old, so he's going to enjoy life as it is and refuse to give in to age. And then on the 23rd, next Friday, I will be talking to Jeremy Seal. I cannot believe the 23rd of December is next Friday, actually. Jeremy Seal is going to be talking to us about his biography of St. Nicholas. Just a reminder that this month's book of the month is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote, which you'll be doing with Humphrey on the 30th of December. So thank you all so much for coming along. Mark, you were an absolute joy to interview. Really great. Good luck with writing Miss Marple. Good luck with this Poirot book. I hope it sells loads of copies, and have a great Christmas. And to everybody else, I will see you hopefully on Tuesday, and you'll hopefully see Humphrey tomorrow. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye. We'll turn our videos off now.